Hey, what's up guys? It's Ryan with RNG Products and welcome back to the channel. Today I'm bringing you a really simple project. We're going to take this existing storage system down and I'm going to put up a nice French cleat wall system. Off camera I have another wall that I'm going to install a French cleat system as well. So obviously the first thing that I will need to do in order to install my French cleat wall is start with the removal of the old storage system. For my project, I'm using 3/4 inch plywood for the French cleats and 1/2 inch plywood to hang on the wall. Since my sheets will hang vertical, I'm going to need 4-foot wide French cleats, so I'm just using my track saw right here and cutting my 3/4 inch pieces down in half. For my French cleats, I measured out 5 inches and then cut the 4x4 into as many strips as I could get. I like to use my track saw to cut my sheets down to a more manageable size. Once I've achieved that, I'll then go ahead and transfer it over to my table saw where it's much quicker for me to break them down. Now, if you don't have access to a track saw, you can always use a straight edge and a skill saw. You can even use a jigsaw. Just use whatever you have available. Once you have all your 5-inch strips cut, you'll need to turn your saw blade to a 45-degree angle and start feeding those 5-inch strips through the table saw. You'll notice here that I pulled out my Craig feather board and went ahead and tightened that up against one of my 5-inch strips. On the very first strip, I noticed it started to wander away from the fence. This feather board will help keep the pressure up against that fence so you get a nice straight 45 across the whole length of the board. Later on, this will help make sure all your French cleats are nice and level on the wall. Now, if you don't have access to a table saw, you can always use a skill saw turned at a 45, and I've even seen people use a bandsaw with a fence and they tilted that table down to a 45 degree as well. Once all my 45 degrees are cut, I like to grab a flat sanding block and put some 220 grit sandpaper and just go over those sharp edges and knock them down nice and flat. And as always, the next material I need is going to be buried behind everything else on my wall. Prior to installing the cleats and hanging on the wall, I'm just using a 1/8 inch round over bit right here on my palm router. It just takes off that sharp edge and really makes a nice presentation when finished. Next, just grab your tape measure, stretch it across that 4x8 and start marking out your spacing for the cleats. There's no standard for the spacing. It's going to be up to each individual what type of spacing they would like for their cleats. Now, if you're extremely lucky like me, you're going to have multiple outlets to contend with. But don't worry, simply make your measurements at the wall, transfer them over to the plywood. Here I'm using a T-square to make sure I get everything aligned just right. And fortunately, I was able to use my plunge saw to cut this square out, and then I utilized a hand saw to finish off the corners. As always, if you don't have a plunge saw, you can always drill 4 holes in the corners and use a jigsaw. Now that you're standing back admiring your precise cutout, don't get all Ricky Rocket just yet. Be sure you manhandle that 4x8 and throw your back out and carry it over to the wall and test the fitment prior to installing the cleats. And while you're standing at the wall, you might as well get out that stud finder and mark out your stud locations. On to the fun part, attaching the cleats. Since we already marked up our spacing earlier, now it's just a matter of taking a nice long T-square and scribing a line across the entire sheet of plywood. You also want to double check and make sure your plywood is square prior to scribing that line. From here on out, the process is pretty straightforward. Apply a liberal amount of glue, line up your cleat with your line, use a 16 gauge brad nailer to attach the cleats to the plywood, and then use your T-square for a sanity check just to make sure that cleat was nice and square. And again, if you were lucky like me and had electrical outlets in the way, just be sure you cut the cleat accordingly as you can see here and use that T-square to make sure it's nice and straight across the board. Also, make sure to stick around to the end of the video as I learned a couple things during this installation process that I'll share with you. Here's a good reason why I marked my stud locations earlier in the video and also measured a reference point from a fixed point. Once you have your French cleat wall in place, simply find that fixed location and transfer those measurements over to the French cleat wall. And here I'm just using a countersink bit and attaching the wall with 3-inch drywall screws into the studs. Now, prior to installing these French cleat walls, I went ahead and put up an accent wall in the corner of my shop where my CNC machine was going to be located. Once I decided to go with the French cleat walls, as you can see here, I had some missing pieces on that accent wall. So right here, I'm simply cutting those strips to size and just using a pin nailer to fill in the gaps. If you are interested in seeing how to make a cheap accent wall like this, I have a link below in the description. It's really easy to do and very cost effective, and I get compliments from everybody that sees it. Although this is a video on how to make a French cleat wall, I will drop some free knowledge out there for my fellow gentlemen. Now would be a fantastic time to improve those relationship goals. Every time you need to lift one of these heavy French cleat panels, I would highly recommend you go grab your spouse or significant other and drag them out into the workshop to help you lift these up and position them against the wall. All kidding aside, guys, these French cleat boards are extremely heavy once all the cleats are attached, and I highly recommend a shop helper to guide you in getting these into position. Once you have your cleat in position, grab a long level it, and place some shims on the bottom to keep it in place. And here I'm just using the same countersink and 3-inch drywall screws. Now for me, I know that I was going to be putting some pretty heavy French cleat holders on this wall. That's why I made sure to use 3-inch screws and get those into the studs. Now, if you've made it this far into the video, congratulations. You have a much longer attention span than I do. But in all seriousness, I do appreciate everyone who has stayed this far into the video. And if you enjoyed the content, now's the time where I should use the overrated term, smash the like button, subscribe, and drop a comment below. Now, if you want to see some of my tool storage and installation tips, keep watching only after the sweet slow-mo montage. Alright you guys, you made it this far into the video, so let's talk about a couple different things that I learned while installing these French cleats, and also a few things I've learned since having these up. I shot the video that you saw prior, probably 6 months ago, and just now got around to editing it. So as you can see right here behind me, my walls do have some tool holders on it already. So one of the first things I would suggest is my shop has 8-foot tall walls. Now, I don't know about you, but I've rarely been in any type of a building that has an exactly perfectly straight ceiling line. So, although these are 4x8 sheets, sometimes I've purchased a 4x8 and it's actually been a little bit longer than 96 inches. So it seems like common sense, but when you bring those sheets home, just throw a tape measure on it and make sure you know what size panels you're working with, which is going to bring me to the next point. If you're trying to lean one of these up on an 8-foot wall, I've got a lot of stuff hanging down from my ceilings, and it makes it just a little challenging because it's an exact fit. So what I personally did is I put my sheets up on my workbench and I actually cut off about 3/4 of an inch to an inch on the bottom. What that allowed me to do was get that panel up into the wall. I leaned it up towards the ceiling, I brought it in, then that allowed me to put some shims on the bottom. You can use anything like playing cards or scrap pieces of your 4x8 sheets. It just depends on how much wiggle room you need. Now with that being said, if you're only installing one 4x8 sheet, it's not that big of a deal because once that sheet is up, you're good to go. But for example, if you take a look at the wall behind me, I actually have 3 sheets running along this wall. So one of the challenges with having multiple sheets is once you've cut your 4-foot French cleats and attached them to your 4x8 and you put that up on the wall, once you set that next sheet up, you're gonna need to have some wiggle room. That way you can get those French cleats to align. You don't want to have a French cleat here a little bit higher than the French cleat here, and then when you're trying to make a tool and you put it up here, you've got one higher and one lower. It's just gonna drive you crazy because your tool storage is gonna sit a little cockeyed and crooked. I don't know, that just bothers me. So another thing I would recommend, everybody has levels in their shop, but make sure you go out and get a nice long level. I would get a minimum of a 4 foot. This is gonna give you, as you saw in the video, plenty of room to get the level on both halves of that panel to make sure you get them nice and level. Now, as far as your plywood options go, we all work with different budgets. Me personally, I didn't want my shop to look like a construction zone, so I went ahead and spent a little extra money and bought some of the premium 4x8 sheets. The half-inch sheets, I believe, were $30 a piece, and the 3/4 inch were $35. At the time, that was a bargain. As we know, since CV19, lumber prices have skyrocketed. They're a little crazy. But for me personally, this is a place where I spend a lot of time, and I wanted it to feel like a really cool environment, so that's why I went ahead and spend a little bit more money. Now, if you don't care and you're on a little bit lower of a budget, by all means, you can source some cheaper plywood. You could even use OSB if you really wanted to. Personal preference. Some people might not like just the plain wood. You could stain the sheet that goes against the wall and then stain the French cleat a different color. You could paint the French cleats. So remember, this is your work studio. You can do whatever you want. You don't have to do it any way that you've seen somebody do it on YouTube or online. Just get creative, have fun with it, and make something that appeals to you. So believe it or not, over on my TikTok platform, I'm asked all the time how to create these walls. And as you guys saw in the video, it's really easy, and you can really make them however you want. You don't have to use 3/4 and 1/2 inch, and like I said, you don't have to use the same type of plywood I use. You can use whatever you have around. The concept is just very simple for the French cleat. You're gonna want to do a 45-degree cut. Your spacing between doesn't matter. The size of your French cleats doesn't matter. It's all user specific for what you need it for. So for me personally, I've got a lot of my Festool items up here on the wall, and I made these special tool holders for them. And the reason I did that is, as much as I love the sustainer system and being able to stack everything up, I use these on a daily basis, and I'm not a contractor. I work here in my shop, so I'm not taking these tools everywhere I go. So for me personally, I hated digging into the sustainers all the time, pulling stuff in and out. That's why I went ahead and just made some of these custom holders, and I do have TikTok videos on almost all of these. So again, I know I keep plugging it, but guys, I do post a lot on there. And one of my favorite things about having this French cleat wall was my ability to free up a lot of my workbench space, and I had a lot of stuff on the floor that I was just constantly kicking and tripping over. So I went ahead and I moved my workbench over here right in front of this big wall that you see right behind me. So now when I'm working on things, I can just turn around and grab it right off of the wall, and it's really improved my workflow, and I'm able to get my projects done a lot faster, and it's freed up a lot more space in my shop. So for me, those are all positive win-win situations. So look guys, I hope everybody got through 2020 best they could. We know that's been one of the craziest years. Moving on into 2021, I'm gonna dedicate myself to producing a lot more YouTube content. For me right now, it's just not possible to post a video every day, but if you guys do wanna see content daily of what I'm doing, I post 2 to 3 times a day on the TikTok platform. I'm gonna have the link below to all my other social medias, but it's gonna be RNG Products at TikTok, and I also post daily to Instagram, so that's gonna be RNG Products at Instagram as well. So if you're not following those channels and you wanna kind of see what I'm doing before I put out a YouTube video, go subscribe to those. A lot of times I'll do a mini series on those platforms, and then I'll say that I'm gonna put out a full-length video on YouTube, so that way you'll know what to look out for. Again, thank you so much for watching. I really appreciate all your comments. I appreciate all the support. I am one of the few guys that if you do comment below, I will do my best to answer your questions and be interactive as often as possible. And with that being said, don't be afraid to drop your opinion or give your advice. I don't know everything there is about woodworking. I'm always learning, and it's always amazing when other people that have better knowledge share that with you. And don't be afraid to ask a silly question, because there is no such thing as a silly question. If you don't know, you don't know. So you gotta ask it, and our community is here to help you guys out. So once again, thank you for watching.